Okay, let's talk spending. The third big power that we're going to talk about with relation to Congress. We've got commerce, we've got taxing, and we've got spending. There are obviously other enumerated powers as well, but those are the three biggest. Most congressional spending is done under the necessary and proper clause because most appropriations that Congress passes are appropriate ways, at least the court would say so, appropriate ways to carry out the enumerated powers of Congress. There's not much of a spending issue, for example, when Congress appropriates money for an aircraft carrier. Assuming anybody would have standing to challenge that, think about that for a minute, mind trick, right? If you assume that anybody would have standing to challenge such an appropriation or an expenditure, Congress would have an easy argument to make, that argument being that having an aircraft carrier is an appropriate means of building a navy. So, most congressional spending is pretty straightforward like that. Now, here's the fact pattern that you want to watch out for. When Congress uses its spending power to try to bribe states to do something. Now, we might ask, first of all, why would Congress bribe states to do something instead of just doing it itself? A couple of reasons. Number one, sometimes Congress might, members of Congress might conclude they don't have the authority to do something. They want states to do it because states have the police power. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, and frankly, sometimes more likely, is that Congress doesn't want to regulate directly because they want to avoid accountability. And this is a problem. The Supreme Court doesn't like it when one of the branches tries to avoid accountability. That sort of causes a breakdown in the system, right, the way things are supposed to work. As I've said many times, the founders envisioned that each branch would jealously guard its own power, that each branch would stay in its own lane. But part of that calculus, part of the deal, part of the social compact, would be that each branch is also responsible, right, accountable for what it does. But politicians being politicians, sometimes they want somebody else to blame. So for example, if Congress wants a national speed limit set at a certain level that's going to be unpopular, they don't want to take the brunt of that. If Congress, to give another example that you're familiar with from your reading, if Congress wants a national drinking age set at 21, certainly, people from 18 to 21 are allowed to vote, right? So, and people from 18 to 21 are not going to be so happy that the Congress thinks it's okay to send them off to war, but not for them to have a beer before they go. So Congress doesn't want, they don't want the blowback from that. So that's another reason. So Congress may try to bribe states to do something if either Congress decides we can't do it, or if they decide, you know what, we don't want to do it. That's the big picture. Now, what does that look like? And this implicates Congress's spending power. It's the spending clause, right? The Article 1, Section 8 says Congress is allowed to spend for the general welfare. Please remember those words. Congress is allowed to spend for the general welfare. Now, when we talk about bribing states, here's what that fact pattern looks like. Congress would develop some kind of program where they're giving away money. Now, we all know how this works in life, right? What one giveth, one can taketh away. So watch out for the fact pattern, please. I mean, these are red flags, right? Watch out for the fact pattern where you see these facts. Congress appropriates money and disperses the money to the states. So here you go, Florida, here's your X number of $1 billion for whatever program we are trying to promote for the general welfare. Then, to bribe states, this is how Congress does it. Then Congress will place conditions on the expenditure of money and giving it to the state. Like, okay, state of Florida, you can have X number of $1 billion, but if you don't do A, B, and C, right, carry out policies that we are trying to carry out here for the general welfare, if you don't do certain things with the money, then we are going to withhold a certain percentage of it. So that's how bribery happens. Here you go, I'm dangling billions of dollars in front of your nose and then telling you I'm withholding a certain percentage of this if you don't do I want you to do. Some would call that a gun to the head. Congress says, I'm sorry, the court says, well, that's okay under some circumstances. The key case to know here is the Dole case. I'm talking about South Dakota versus Dole, which obviously comes to us from South Dakota. What had happened here? You see the classic fact pattern. Congress was appropriating money for highway funds. Oftentimes, I guess here's another reason you would bribe states to do stuff instead of doing it yourself. Sometimes you lack the federal infrastructure to manage a national program like that, that kind of scope. At any rate, whatever its reason, right, Congress is appropriating money for highway funds. So far you have Congress, you have an appropriation of money. You should already think, I think there might be a spending thing going on here. Okay, then you find out, and now you know it's a spending clause, right, problem. Then you find out Congress threatens to withhold, and does withhold, 5% of your federal highway funds. If you're a state, Congress withholds 5% of your federal highway funds if you don't change your drinking age to 21. Right? So they're trying to get the national drinking age bumped up to 21. Congress may not have the power to set a national drinking age. It might, but it might not. Certainly, as I discussed earlier in this video, there would be political reasons for Congress not to want to set itself, right, to set the national drinking age at 21. So that's what Congress does. So that sets it up beautifully, right? You have Congress acting, you have an appropriation, you have money going to states, and you have Congress withholding some of that money if the states don't do what Congress wants. That's your classic Congress bribing states fact pattern. Then what you do, you apply Dole. And I got some good news for you in this video. Under South Dakota versus Dole, we apply elements, a nice old elements test. And I'm going to run through 5 here. And the 5th is a combination of the Dole case and also Sebelius, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, the first element, the court says, sometimes we will let Congress bribe states to do stuff. Maybe that's a decent arrangement, as long as Congress hasn't gone so far that it has really insulted, if you will, the sovereignty of the states. Let's talk about how is the court going to develop some guardrails here to make sure that, yes, Congress can have its own policy objectives, and yes, it can enlist the states to help them reach those policy objectives, but Congress can't wholesale coerce states into doing something. So, to put up those guardrails, the court says here are the elements that you have to meet. If you meet these elements, by the way, courts typically call these the Dole factors. You know, this happens, sloppy language. They're not factors, they're elements. If one of them is missing, the Congress's program is going to be struck down. Number 1, as the text itself says, the spending has to be for the general welfare. This requires us to talk briefly about a case called Helvering versus Davis. That went up to the Supreme Court. There was a challenge to Social Security spending, really it's old age benefits, and the allegation was that because it was benefits based on old age, it wasn't for the general welfare, it was for old people. General welfare means everybody. The court says happy old people is good for everybody. Okay. So the court is pretty liberal about this general welfare element. The spending has to be for the general welfare. Well, there are a lot of things that technically help one group of people, but there are lots of groups of people that when you help them, you're really helping all of us. Just for example, I mean, helping old people maintain an independent lifestyle helps their families. You know, I mean, if I've got old people in my family who can't live on their own, maybe they're living with me. So that's, you know, it helps everybody. So you're not going to see the court striking down a spending program because it only helps kids or it only helps people who are sick. Right? Helping those people helps everybody. Don't get hung up on the general welfare thing. Make sure you mention it. Make sure you say what it means. It means benefits all of us. But courts are pretty liberal about applying that. The next element the court lays out is unambiguity. Okay, the bribery has to be unambiguous. So let's think about that for a minute. If somebody is bribing me, if somebody is holding a gun to my head, again, this just goes back to just thinking about common sense wise, right? So somebody's telling me, right, yeah, gun to the head. Somebody's got a gun to my head. There are two things I want to know, and I want to know them immediately, and I want to know them with specificity. Number one is, what do you want? Okay, if you're holding a gun to my head, you have to tell me what you want. Right? So the court says that if you're going to bribe states like this, you have to unambiguously, clearly. Ambiguous means capable of more than one interpretation. That's important. That's different from vague. Vague just means general. Ambiguous means capable of competing interpretations. So you can't do that to me, right? You can't tell me that you want something that's ambiguous, because then you leave me guessing what you want. And if I'm the one with the gun to my head, I'm entitled to know. So you need to be concrete. The second thing that I want to know immediately and with great clarity is whether you're really going to use that gun. Okay? Two things. What do you want from me, and what are you going to do to me if I say no? Those are the things I need to know. So under this element, Congress's bribery has to be unambiguous. Those things are what we're talking about. Congress must tell the state exactly what Congress wants, and Congress must tell the state exactly what it stands to lose. Next, the court says there has to be some reasonable or logical nexus between the policy goals, right, what you're trying to achieve, and the spending, the type of spending that you're threatening to withhold. So to illustrate that point, in the Dole case, the policy objective was drinking age 21, and the spending withheld was highway funds. So we're asking, is there some logical, reasonable nexus or relationship between the drinking age and highways? Everybody get that? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Of course, the court in Dole says there is a reasonable, logical relationship. The drinking age, right, changing the drinking age relates to that. Highway safety. Well, why? Well, because if one state has a drinking age of 18 and another state, and a neighboring state has a drinking age of 21, then people from the state where the drinking age is 21 are going to drive across the border, right, to where the drinking age is 18 and then drive home. So you've got traffic issues of people driving drunk. So there is a relationship between the policy objective and the spending, the type of spending being withheld. The fourth element I always consider sort of a throwaway. Obviously, I don't know why this even needs to be stated, but Congress cannot bribe states to do something that is otherwise unconstitutional. So, for example, Congress could not bribe states to, we'll withhold all of your money for X if you, unless you eliminate jury trials, right? Well, that's ridiculous. You can't bribe states to do something that is unconstitutional. The fifth element, which is implicit or implied in Dole, but is made explicit in Sebelius, is that the measure, whatever Congress is doing, the program can't be, know this word, coercive, right? You can't coerce states. To coerce means to force, to leave with no choice. This kind of goes back to the unambiguous thing, right? I mean, you have to tell me what my choice is and what I stand to lose if I don't do it. To coerce somebody is to leave them with no choice at all. And at that point, the court says we would see and perceive an insult to state sovereignty if you're not leaving states with any choice about whether to do what you're asking them to do. So you can encourage them, right? You can structure this package so that you're encouraging states to do something, but you can't leave them with no choice at all. Then you're really just commandeering the state. We'll talk about that later. And forcing the state to do something, and then you really are invading the state's province, right, to regulate on its own behalf. So, with those elements in mind, let's look at the facts in Dole. So, number one, general welfare. Highway safety is the policy objective, right? Drinking age affects that. So, is that who uses the roads? Again, the court's not going to get hung up on this, right? It is to everybody's benefit that our highways be safe, that people not drive drunk. Okay, good. Check that one off. Unambiguous. Two things have to be unambiguous. Number one, what do you want? This is very simple. The Congress says, here's what we want. You need to have a drinking age of 21. Is there anything that you don't understand about that? Right? One of these things, okay, I get it. Drinking age, 21. That's unambiguous. There's nothing, that's not capable of more than one interpretation. Second thing you need to tell me is how much I stand to lose, right? What do I stand to lose? And so Congress says, here it is, 5% of your highway money. So what part of 5% don't you understand? Right, there you go. That's how you think about this. It's there again, Congress is good to go. There's nothing ambiguous about this. It's very simple what Congress wants, and it's very simple what's going to be lost. Now watch out. I've put fact patterns on exams where Congress says if you don't do X, then the Secretary of Interior or some other federal official will withhold anywhere between 5 and 25% of your federal X funds at that person's discretion. And I'll have students just kind of blasé say, oh, that's unambiguous, it's 5 to 25%. Well, now, wait a minute. If I'm the state of Florida and you're telling me that if I don't do your program, right, that I'll lose anywhere from 5 to 25% of my money, I have no idea how much money is at stake here. It could be 5%, it could be 25%. Those are not consistent with one another. And at the discretion of some federal official, what is that? So please think about this stuff, right? And watch out for that stuff. That would be a problem. So, at any rate, in Dole, the court says we're good to go. This is unambiguous. Is there a nexus? We just talked about that. In the Dole case, the court said there is a logical nexus. How would you mess that up in an exam fact pattern? Always think about that. Right here, there is a logical nexus. What if Congress had said, if you don't change your drinking age to 21, if you don't have a drinking age of 21, we will withhold school lunch money from your federal school lunch money from toddlers at K through grade 6. Okay. Now you'd have a court saying, what? Wait a minute. What is the policy objective, drinking age of 21, have to do with school lunch money for kids? Right? That's how you mess it up. There's no logical relationship between the spending, the type of spending you're withholding, and the policy objective you're trying to achieve. So, but here, there's a logical nexus, no problem. You're not asking the states to do anything unconstitutional. You don't have a constitutional right to drink alcohol before you're 21. So there are no, so that fourth element is not even in play, which is typically the case. And then finally, we find out that the court says 5% of your money, right, 5% of your funds in a certain area is not coercive. The court says this is a mild encouragement. Now, state might beg to differ. 5% of your federal highway funds is a lot of cash. Nonetheless, the court says, so now you have an example. It looks like when Congress gives you money for something and says we're going to withhold 5% if you don't do X, okay, that's a mild encouragement. That's not coercive. Now you want to compare that to the Sebelius case, and this is really important. Sebelius, now we've seen it 3 times. Sebelius for the Commerce Clause, Sebelius for taxing, and now we're look at Sebelius for spending. Why? The Affordable Care Act, Congress envisioned that states would administer these marketplaces, right? The exchanges is what we call them. So each state was going to set up its own exchange. Why? And here we have a problem. There's no federal infrastructure for this to handle that volume of business. So the idea was each state would set up its own exchange. Private insurance companies would compete on these exchanges, right? You'd have a menu of choices. Anybody who's used the Affordable Care Act, you know how to do this, right? You get on there and you have a menu of options and you choose what you want. So this is the way Congress wants to administer this program. So they bribe states to do it because they don't have the infrastructure, right? The federal infrastructure to do it. And here's what they say. States, you are required to set up these exchanges. If you don't, then you will lose 100%. We will withhold 100. Look at this. there's money being appropriated. It's Medicaid. Okay, so money is being appropriated to the states. Congress is threatening to withhold it, so you know you're being tested on spending. And so here, Congress says, we will withhold all of your federal Medicaid funds if you don't set up the exchange. I don't know who wrote that, but whoever wrote it should have really read Dole more carefully, because in South Dakota versus Dole, the court was pretty clear that it didn't want Congress leaving states with no choice whatsoever. So here we focus in on, and this is why you know these are elements, right? You focus in here on that last element. Is this coercive? And of course the answer is yes. Withholding 100%, you don't leave a state any choice at all. There's not a state in the union that can forego 100% of its Medicaid money without having a public health care disaster on its hands. So that would leave states with no choice whatsoever, and the court says what you would have predicted it would have said. This is unduly coercive. It does not leave states in a position to make an intelligent choice. They're being forced to do what you want them to do. So now you know, when you're asking whether the withholding is unduly coercive, that 5% the court has said, no, that's not. 100% the court has said, obviously that is. So you know how this works. If you got an essay question about it, you're probably going to find yourself somewhere in the middle, and you don't worry about the right answer. You just worry about, you know, which one does it look more like? Does it look more like Dole, where Congress is withholding, you know, a small 5% of a program, or is it more like massive amounts of money that Congress threatened to withhold in the Affordable Care Act? So what happened? That part of the law was struck down. The bribing the states part of the law was struck down as unconstitutional, violation of the Dole elements. And although it wasn't ambiguous, I mean, it met some of the elements, but you failed one, and that's the end of it. So it fails under Dole. And this is why anybody who remembers this, I'm so old, I don't know if people who are really young now would even remember this, or at least remember it well. But this is why we had that big problem with the exchange crashing, because then what happened was states now are under no obligation. That part of the law is unconstitutional. By the time the court says that, Congress is under Republican control. So Congress has no interest whatsoever in fixing the problem, right? Because they could have gone back and said, okay, we'll just withhold 7%, something like that, see if that works. But that would have, right? But fixing the law would have required that Democrats still have control of Congress. They didn't. So you have a Republican Congress saying, oh good, we'll just leave it the way it is, right? So now states have a choice whether they're going to have an exchange or not. And what happened is what you'd expect to happen. Mostly, if Republicans were in charge of a state, there was no exchange. If Democrats were in charge of a state, they went ahead and set up an exchange. So what that left was a whole lot of people in this country going on to a federal exchange, right? Because that was supposed to be the backup, right? Any stray people who can't find what they need on their state exchange can come over to the federal exchange, or anybody who for some reason doesn't have a state exchange can come to the federal exchange. Well, this left so many people going over to the federal exchange that it crashed, because again, it wasn't designed for that. Now it's up and running. You know, they eventually fixed it, but that's how that happened. If you're wondering, if you were aware of that back then, right? How did the federal program crash like that? How did the system crash like that? That's the reason it crashed, because the law was poorly drafted. The attempt to bribe states was struck down, and that left states free to do whatever they want. Many of them did not set up exchanges. That left everybody going to the federal exchange, which crashed. All right, that is spending in a nutshell. So when you look at, one more time, the facts you want to see when you're being tested on spending: Congress giveth, Congress withholdeth. Okay, right? If you're a state, if you don't do what Congress wants, and so then when you see that fact pattern, you run through the 5 elements under South Dakota versus Dole. You do your best to resolve the case, and you move on. So that's spending. So now we've done commerce, taxing, and spending. Until I see you again, stay safe and stay tuned.